I was driving down this long, desolate road on a rainy night, the windshield wipers fighting against the relentless downpour. That's when I saw him, this figure standing on the side of the road, drenched and holding out his thumb, signaling for a ride. I hesitated at first, but then I thought about how miserable it must be out there in that storm, so I pulled over. He hurried in, grateful, thanking me for stopping. He seemed harmless enough, just a guy trying to escape the rain. But as soon as he settled in, there was this odd energy, this tension in the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried making conversation, asking where he was headed, but he was evasive, keeping his answers short and vague. I should have trusted my instincts and just kept driving, but I didn't want to seem rude. Besides, he was just a hitchhiker, a stranger, harmless, or so I thought. Minutes turned into an hour, and I noticed something strange. He wasn't giving any indication that he wanted to leave. I hinted that my stop was coming up soon, hoping he'd take the cue, but he just nodded and stayed put. I felt this growing sense of unease, this realization that something was off. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the way he avoided my questions, the way he kept glancing at me in this unsettling way, it made my skin crawl. I decided to pull over at a gas station, pretending I needed to refuel. I thought it might give me an opportunity to subtly indicate that this was where our journey together ended. But when I turned to tell him, I froze. He was staring at me, this intense gaze, like he was studying me, and it sent a chill down my spine. I mumbled something about needing to stop for gas and went inside the station, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But when I came back out, he was still there, sitting in the car, as if he had no intention of getting out. My heart raced, panic rising inside me. I couldn't just leave him there, and I didn't want to confront him directly either. I got back into the driver's seat, trying to keep my composure, but every minute that passed felt like an eternity. I decided to take a different route, hoping to throw him off, to get him out of my car without causing a scene. But he didn't seem bothered by the change in direction, just sat there, watching me. I drove faster, this urgency to get away from him, this feeling of being trapped in my own car with a stranger who refused to leave. It felt like he was toying with me, enjoying my discomfort, and I didn't know what he was capable of. As I kept driving, the storm intensified, lightning flashing across the sky, illuminating his face for brief moments. It was this haunting sight, this eerie smile that etched into my memory, sending shivers down my spine. I finally found a spot where I could pull over, a well-lit area with other cars nearby. I hoped he'd take the opportunity to leave, to find another ride, but he didn't budge. He just sat there, that unsettling smile never leaving his face. I knew I had to do something, so I feigned an emergency phone call, pretending it was urgent, hoping it'd prompt him to leave. But he just stared at me, unmoved, this chilling calmness in his demeanor. I felt this rising panic, this fear of what he might do. I wanted to scream for help, but I didn't want to provoke him either. I was trapped, cornered in my own car with this stranger who refused to go. I tried to reason with him, to ask politely for him to leave, but he just laughed, this hollow, menacing laugh that echoed in the car. It was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. I mustered up every ounce of courage and opened the door, hoping he'd follow suit, but he didn't move. He just sat there, watching me, this unnerving calmness in his eyes. In a surge of desperation, I bolted out of the car, leaving it behind, and ran towards the other parked vehicles, screaming for help. People came rushing, asking what happened, and I pointed towards my car, but when we looked back, he was gone. I booked a room in this remote hotel, wanting some time away from the hustle. The place seemed fine, a bit eerie maybe, with its old-fashioned decor and creaky floors. But I shrugged it off, thinking it added to the charm. The storm outside was intense, the wind howling, rain pounding against the windows. I settled into my room, hoping for a quiet night. But as I was about to doze off, I heard footsteps outside my door, this slow, deliberate pacing. I peeked through the peephole, but I didn't see anyone. It could have been just the creaky floors echoing, but it made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was my imagination acting up due to the storm. But then, I heard it again, these footsteps in the corridor, getting closer to my room. I hesitated, debating whether to check or not. Part of me wanted to believe it was just another guest, maybe having trouble finding their room. I opened the door cautiously, peering outside, but the corridor was empty. The only thing I heard was the howling wind and the faint sound of rain. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the storm playing tricks on me. As I closed the door and got back into bed, I heard a faint tapping, like someone was rapping their fingers against the walls. I felt this growing unease, this sense of being watched, and I couldn't shake it off. I tried distracting myself, reading a book, but I kept glancing towards the door, this irrational fear gnawing at me. Then, I heard it again, the tapping, but this time, it was closer, almost right outside my room. I decided to investigate, to see if someone needed help or if it was just my imagination running wild. As I stepped into the corridor, I saw a figure at the far end, standing in the dim light, but they quickly vanished around the corner. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. The corridor was empty, no sign of anyone. I felt this rising panic, this feeling of being alone in this deserted place with someone lurking in the shadows. I returned to my room, locked the door, and tried to reassure myself that it was just a guest wandering around. But I couldn't shake off this fear, this sense of something sinister lingering in the hotel. The tapping continued intermittently, faint but persistent. It felt like it was coming from the walls, almost as if someone was trying to communicate, and it sent chills down my spine. I called the front desk, asking if they had noticed anything strange, but they assured me the hotel was empty, except for me. That made me more anxious. I was sure I heard someone, or something. As the night wore on, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I tried to drown it out with music, but it only intensified, this eerie rhythm that seemed to echo through the walls. I peeked through the peephole again, but this time, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the corridor. It was there for a split second, then vanished, leaving me shaken to the core. I didn't dare leave my room again. I felt this overwhelming paranoia, this fear that someone was watching me, observing my every move. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, this sense of impending doom hanging over me. The storm outside raged on, adding to the intensity of the situation. It felt like the hotel was closing in on me, suffocating me with this inexplicable dread. Then, there was this sudden silence, the tapping stopped, the wind outside calmed. It was eerie, this abrupt change, and I felt this impending sense of something about to happen. I heard a faint whisper, so faint I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination. It was this unintelligible voice, a mere murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I checked the door, the locks, everything, making sure I was secure. But then, I heard the sound of a door creaking open somewhere down the corridor. It was subtle, but in the silence, it felt deafening. I stayed in my room, petrified, waiting for dawn to break, for the storm to subside. I felt this overwhelming relief when the first light of morning filtered through the windows. I rushed to leave, not caring about anything else, just wanting to escape that place. I reported it to the hotel staff, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just a storm playing tricks. I was driving down this desolate stretch of road, the rain pounding relentlessly against the windshield. It was getting late, and the storm was getting worse by the minute. That's when I spotted this deserted gas station up ahead, the only sanctuary in the pouring rain. I pulled in, hoping to wait out the storm. The place looked abandoned, old and worn, but at least it offered shelter from the downpour. As I sat in my car, I noticed a figure standing under the awning, partially hidden in the shadows. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking they were just seeking refuge from the rain like me. But something about their posture, the way they stood there, it felt off. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid due to the storm. Minutes turned into an hour, and that figure was still there, unmoving. It made me uneasy, this sense of being watched, and I started to regret pulling over. But I didn't want to risk driving in that storm. I tried distracting myself with music, pretending everything was okay, but I couldn't shake off this feeling of unease. I glanced outside, and that figure was now closer, staring at me with this intense, almost menacing gaze. I locked the car doors, this irrational fear creeping in, but part of me hoped I was just overreacting. I tried to convince myself they were harmless, just a person seeking shelter. But then, they started walking towards my car, slow and deliberate. Panic surged through me. I didn't want any trouble, and something about their approach felt threatening. I debated whether to start the engine and leave, but I felt frozen, trapped in this unsettling situation. The figure reached my car and stood there, peering inside, their face obscured by the rain. I pretended not to notice, hoping they'd just leave, but they didn't. Instead, they knocked on the window, this forceful rap that made me jump. I hesitated, not wanting to engage, but they knocked again, more insistently. Reluctantly, I cracked the window open, trying to keep my voice steady, asking if they needed something. But they just stood there, staring at me, not saying a word. I could feel this growing sense of dread, this gut feeling that something wasn't right. I wanted to drive away, to escape that eerie encounter, but I was frozen in fear, unsure of what they might do. Then, they muttered something, barely audible over the storm, words that I couldn't comprehend. It sent a chill down my spine, this incomprehensible whisper that made my heart race. I decided to leave, to get away from that unsettling presence. I started the engine, but as I moved to drive off, they stepped in front of the car, blocking my path. My heart sank. This was turning into a nightmare. I honked the horn, hoping to scare them off, but they didn't flinch. They just stood there, this unyielding figure, staring at me through the windshield. I was trapped, panic setting in, not knowing what to do. I contemplated calling for help, but my phone had no signal in that remote area. I felt this overwhelming sense of vulnerability, this feeling of being at their mercy. I tried reasoning with them, pleading for them to let me go, but they just stood there, unmoved. It felt like an eternity, this tense standoff, the rain drumming down relentlessly. Then, suddenly, they backed away, allowing me to drive off. I didn't waste a second. I sped away, not looking back, my heart racing, hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached a more populated area, a place where I felt safer. I reported it to the authorities, but without much to go on, they couldn't do anything. That night at the deserted gas station, that encounter, it left me shaken to my core. The fear, the uncertainty, it felt like a nightmare I couldn't escape, a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking in the most unexpected places. I was on this road trip through Texas, looking for a place to crash for the night. The storm was brewing, the sky darkening with heavy clouds. I found this secluded Airbnb, a small cabin nestled in the woods, seemed perfect to wait out the storm. The place was eerie from the get-go, this unsettling vibe that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The host greeted me, but there was something off about him, this peculiar look in his eyes that made me uneasy. He showed me around, seemed friendly enough, but I sensed this underlying tension, this feeling that he was hiding something. I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired from the road. As the storm intensified, the power went out, leaving the cabin in darkness. I tried to make the best of it, lit some candles, and settled in. But that unease lingered, this sense that something wasn't right. The host kept lingering around, offering to keep me company, which felt odd. I declined politely, wanting to be left alone. But he seemed insistent, this eerie persistence that made me uncomfortable. I decided to lock the door, feeling this growing sense of unease. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild due to the storm. But then, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I peeked through the window, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything. I dismissed it, thinking it might be an animal or just the wind. I settled in bed, hoping to get some sleep, but then I heard this faint scratching at the door. It was subtle, almost like someone tracing their fingers along the wood, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I felt this rising panic, this fear of someone trying to get in. I wanted to call for help, but there was no signal. I was on my own, in the middle of nowhere. Then, there was this sudden knock on the door, this forceful rap that made me jump. I didn't dare answer. Something about it felt menacing. The knocking continued, more insistent this time, and I heard the host's voice, saying he wanted to check if I was okay. But his tone, it sounded off, almost menacing. I stayed quiet, hoping he'd just leave. But then, the knocking turned into banging, this loud thud that echoed through the cabin. I panicked, not knowing what to do. I looked around for something to defend myself, but I was helpless, trapped in that cabin with this looming threat outside. The banging stopped suddenly, and there was this eerie silence, the kind that made my heart race faster. I heard whispers, faint voices outside, and I felt this overwhelming dread wash over me. I crept towards the window, trying to see outside, but there was nothing, just darkness. And then, the power came back on, illuminating the cabin in a flickering light. I saw shadows moving outside, figures lurking in the woods, and my heart sank. I knew I had to get out of there, had to leave that place before things got worse. I grabbed my things, not caring about anything else, and bolted towards my car. As I drove away, I saw the host standing outside, this unsettling smile on his face, waving goodbye. I was driving through this desolate road, rain pelting down hard. The night was pitch black, only the headlights cutting through the darkness. I needed to stop, catch my breath, and maybe stretch my legs. I saw this dimly lit parking lot, a faint glow in the distance, a welcome sight amidst the storm. I pulled in, the rain pounding against the car. It was eerily quiet, the only sound being the raindrops hitting the roof. I didn't see anyone around, just an empty lot surrounded by darkness. I stepped out, hoping for a moment of respite. But then, I heard footsteps, this distinct sound over the rainfall. I looked around, but the lot seemed deserted. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, I thought. I walked towards the sheltered area, seeking cover from the rain. That's when I noticed a figure, this shadowy silhouette at the far end of the lot. It gave me this unsettling feeling, this sense of being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just someone seeking shelter like me. But then, the figure started walking towards me, this determined pace that sent a shiver down my spine. I quickened my steps, feeling this growing unease. Maybe they just needed help, I tried to reassure myself. But the closer they got, the more I felt this sense of impending danger. I reached the covered area, hoping to find someone else there, but it was empty. I turned around, and the figure was there, standing at the edge of the light, this haunting presence in the downpour. I felt this surge of panic, this primal instinct to flee. I wanted to run, to get back in my car and drive away. But I couldn't move, frozen in fear. The figure stepped closer, their face obscured by the rain. They didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. It felt threatening, this aggressive posture, this sense of being pursued. I tried to reason, asking if they needed something, my voice shaky in the storm. But they just stood there, unmoving, this unsettling silence between us. I felt this overwhelming urge to leave, to escape that place. I turned around, ready to run back to my car, but then they lunged towards me, this sudden movement that startled me. I dodged and ran, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through me. I could hear their footsteps behind me, this pursuit in the dark, the rain making it hard to see. I reached my car, fumbled for the keys, my hands trembling. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine, not daring to look back. I peeled out of there, the tires screeching in the rain. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anyone. I drove as fast as I could, wanting to get as far away as possible from that chilling encounter. I was driving down this lonely road, rain pouring down in sheets. My car started acting up, making these weird noises, and then it just sputtered and died. I pulled over, frustrated and soaked from the rain. It was a desolate area, no sign of life around. I popped the hood, hoping to figure out what was wrong, but I'm no mechanic. I was stuck, miles away from any help. Then, out of nowhere, I saw this figure approaching through the rain. It was a man, walking towards me, carrying an umbrella. Seemed like a good Samaritan, offering to help in the storm. He introduced himself, said he lived nearby and offered to take a look at the car. Seemed harmless, maybe even friendly. I was relieved, thinking my luck was turning around. But as he checked the engine, I noticed this odd glint in his eye, this strange intensity that didn't sit right. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. He said he needed a tool from his place and offered to bring it. I agreed, grateful for the help. But as he walked away, something about his demeanor, this sense of unease, it lingered. Minutes turned into an hour, and he hadn't returned. I started feeling this growing anxiety, this suspicion that something wasn't right. I decided to take a look around. As I walked down the road, I saw his umbrella lying abandoned on the ground. It felt ominous, this sense of foreboding, and I knew I had to get out of there. I rushed back to my car, wanting to leave, but then I heard footsteps behind me. It was him, walking towards me, this unsettling smile on his face. I felt this overwhelming fear, this sense of danger. I fumbled for my phone, wanting to call for help, but it was dead. I was completely vulnerable, alone with this stranger in the rain. He asked if I needed a ride, said his place wasn't far. But something about his offer, it felt wrong. I declined, trying to maintain composure, but he insisted, this persistence that felt threatening. I made an excuse, saying I'd wait for a tow truck. But then, he reached into his pocket, and that's when I saw it, this glint of a knife in his hand. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't good. I didn't waste a second. I ran into the woods, adrenaline driving me forward. I heard him chasing after me, this mad pursuit in the darkness and rain. I ran as fast as I could, not knowing where I was going, just desperate to escape. The rain made it hard to see, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled, fell, but forced myself up, this fear pushing me to keep going. I could hear him behind me, closing in, and that only fueled my panic. I finally reached a main road, flagged down a passing car, and pleaded for help. I told them about the man chasing me, but when we went back, he was gone. The police searched the area, but there was no trace of him. They said I was lucky to get away, that it could have been worse. That night in the rain, the car trouble, that man's unsettling presence, it felt like a nightmare. It was a stormy night, the rain drumming against the windows. My wife and I were at home, cozy and settled in for the evening. We didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, this abrupt sound that shattered the silence. It caught us off guard. We weren't expecting visitors at this hour, especially not in this weather. I peered through the peephole, trying to see who it was. There stood this man, drenched in rain, holding a phone, claiming he needed to make an urgent call. I hesitated, something about him felt off. But then, sympathy got the better of me. I couldn't leave someone stranded in a storm. I opened the door a crack, trying to maintain caution. He seemed polite, asking if he could use the phone just for a minute. I glanced at my wife, seeking her approval, and she nodded reluctantly. As he entered, this sense of unease crept over me. He seemed jittery, nervous, casting furtive glances around the house. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just anxious from the storm. He dialed the number and spoke in hushed tones, something about needing a ride. It all seemed innocent, but there was this nagging feeling at the back of my mind, this growing suspicion. My wife and I exchanged glances, this silent understanding passing between us. We wanted him to leave, to be gone from our home. But we didn't want to seem rude or inhospitable. Then, he abruptly ended the call, this abruptness that startled us. He turned to us, this unsettling smile on his face, thanking us for the help. I gestured towards the door, wanting him to leave, but he didn't budge. He just stood there, this eerie silence lingering in the room. My wife spoke up, asking if he needed anything else, trying to subtly hint that it was time for him to go. But he ignored her, this persistence in his gaze that made my skin crawl. He started asking odd questions, personal ones, about our home, about us. It felt invasive, this intrusion into our privacy. My wife and I exchanged worried glances, wondering what his intentions were. Then, he asked if he could stay for a while longer, this casual request that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I tried to politely decline, but he insisted, this unsettling persistence in his tone. I felt this growing sense of dread, this fear of what might happen if we didn't get him to leave. I tried to remain composed, to assert our boundaries, but he seemed unfazed, almost amused. He started pacing, this erratic movement that made my heart race faster. I didn't know what to do. I wanted him out, but he wouldn't leave. Then, he glanced at the window, commenting on how vulnerable we were with the storm raging outside. It sent a chill down my spine, this insinuation that he knew we were isolated, that we were at his mercy. My wife tried to diffuse the tension, offering him a warm drink, hoping it might encourage him to leave. But he declined, this unsettling smile on his face, this sense of menace growing with every passing second. I knew we had to get him out, to protect ourselves, but I didn't want to escalate the situation. I glanced at my wife, silently urging her to stay calm, to not provoke him. Then, he started inching closer, this slow and deliberate movement that set off every alarm in my head. I wanted to scream, to demand he leave, but fear held me back. I tried to steer the conversation towards the door, to hint that it was time for him to go, but he seemed unbothered, almost amused by our discomfort. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Panic surged through me. It was like a nightmare come true. My heart raced, and in that moment of darkness, he disappeared from sight. I reached for my phone, wanting to call for help, but the battery was dead. My wife and I huddled together, this sense of impending danger looming over us. Then, there was a sound, this faint whisper, a voice in the darkness. It was him, this chilling whisper that made my blood run cold. He was still there, lurking somewhere in the shadows. We heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. I grabbed whatever I could find, ready to defend us, my heart pounding in my chest. But then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the power came back on. And he was gone, vanished into thin air. We called the police, reported the incident, but without much to go on, they couldn't do anything. I was at this bus stop, a typical rainy night, waiting for the bus. The street was empty, illuminated only by the sporadic glow of streetlights. I was lost in my thoughts, just wanting to get home. Then, I noticed this man across the street. He seemed normal at first, just waiting for something or someone, I thought. But then he started glancing in my direction, this lingering stare that made me uneasy. I tried to ignore him, hoping he'd leave me alone, but he crossed the street and walked towards me. I felt this knot in my stomach, this instinctive fear. He started with small talk, asking about the bus schedule, but his tone, his mannerisms, there was something off about him. I didn't want to engage, kept my answers short, hoping he'd get the hint. But he persisted, this eerie persistence that made my skin crawl. He started asking personal questions, invading my space, and I felt this growing sense of unease. I checked the time, hoping the bus would arrive soon, but it was running late. I glanced around, hoping to spot someone else, anyone, but the street was empty, just me and this stranger. He moved closer, invading my personal space, this unsettling proximity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to step back, to create distance, but he mirrored my movements, this persistent closeness that felt suffocating. He started commenting on my appearance, this discomforting gaze that made me feel exposed. I wanted to leave, to run, but the bus stop offered no escape. I pretended to be on a call, hoping it would deter him, but he didn't back off. He kept talking, this unnerving chatter that felt invasive. I saw the bus approaching in the distance, relief washing over me. But then, he blocked my path, this menacing stance that made it clear he wasn't going to let me leave easily. I pleaded with him, trying to remain calm, to not provoke him. I asked him to let me go, to leave me alone, but he just laughed, this chilling laughter that echoed in the empty street. The bus arrived, and I made a dash for it, hoping to escape. But he followed, this persistent pursuit that petrified me. I got on the bus, hoping it would offer safety, but he tried to follow. I screamed for the driver to close the doors, to not let him in. The driver intervened, closing the doors just in time, keeping him out. As the bus drove away, I saw him through the window, this sinister figure standing in the rain, watching the bus leave. I felt this overwhelming sense of relief mixed with a chilling fear. I got this mysterious message, asking for a late-night meeting at this desolate spot. It was a favor for a buddy, so I felt I had to. It was pouring rain, the kind that makes you want to stay indoors, but curiosity got the better of me. I agreed, not really knowing what to expect. I arrived at the spot, this isolated area, illuminated only by sporadic flashes of lightning. It felt eerie, this sense of foreboding hanging in the air. I waited, feeling this growing unease with every passing minute. Then, I saw someone approaching through the rain. I couldn't make out their face, it was shrouded in darkness. They came closer, this mysterious figure in the downpour. As they got nearer, something felt off, this sense of danger creeping up my spine. But before I could react, they pulled a hood over their head, concealing their face completely. I hesitated, wanting to leave, but they motioned for me to stay. I felt trapped, this sense of being lured into something I shouldn't have agreed to. They handed me a package, this mysterious parcel wrapped in cloth. I didn't know what it was, but I felt this rising dread in the pit of my stomach. I tried to leave, to make an excuse, but they insisted I open it. Reluctantly, I did. Inside, there was this strange object, something I couldn't quite comprehend. Then, they demanded something in return, something I wasn't willing to give. I tried to reason, to explain I couldn't fulfill their request, but they wouldn't listen. Suddenly, they grabbed me, this forceful grip that sent a chill down my spine. I struggled, trying to break free, but they were overpowering. They pinned me down, this terrifying struggle in the rain. I screamed for help, hoping someone would hear, but the storm drowned out my cries. I managed to break away, running through the rain, heart pounding in my chest. But they chased after me, this relentless pursuit that felt never-ending. I stumbled and fell, the muddy ground giving way beneath me. I got up, but they were right behind me, this relentless figure in the dark. I reached for my phone, wanting to call for help, but it had fallen in the struggle, lost in the mud. I felt this overwhelming sense of helplessness, this dread of what might happen next. I tried to reason with them, to make them see reason, but they were unyielding. They wanted something from me, something I couldn't give. I managed to create some distance, this brief respite that gave me a glimmer of hope. But they kept coming, this unrelenting determination to get what they wanted. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just desperate to escape. The rain made it hard to see, my clothes drenched, and every step felt like a battle against the storm and this unknown threat. I saw a distant light, a faint hope of finding help. I ran towards it, adrenaline driving me forward, the fear of what might happen if I didn't make it there in time. I reached the light, this isolated house in the middle of nowhere. I banged on the door, pleading for someone to let me in, to call for help. Thankfully, they opened, shocked to see me in that state. I tried to explain, but my words came out in panicked gasps. They called the authorities, and the stranger disappeared into the night. It was raining heavily, and I needed a ride home. I booked a rideshare, hoping to get back quickly. The car arrived, and I got in, just wanting to reach home safe and sound. The driver seemed normal at first, polite and courteous. But as we started the journey, I noticed something off about him, this unsettling vibe that made me uneasy. He started making strange comments, asking personal questions that felt invasive. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just being friendly, but it felt off-putting. As we drove, he took unfamiliar routes, deviating from the usual path. I tried to inquire, but he just brushed it off, saying it was a shortcut. I felt this growing unease, this sense of being taken somewhere I didn't want to go. He started talking in this strange, almost hypnotic tone, this eerie conversation that made me uncomfortable. I tried to engage less, hoping he'd get the hint, but he kept talking, this persistent chatter that felt suffocating. Then, he turned off the main road onto the secluded path, this desolate route that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I asked him where we were going, trying to hide my rising panic. He ignored my question, this sinister smile on his face. I felt this overwhelming fear, this realization that I was in a dangerous situation. I looked around, but there was no one in sight, no help to be found. I wanted to leave, to get out of the car, but we were in the middle of nowhere. I pretended to receive a call, hoping it might deter him, but he just kept driving, this eerie determination in his eyes. I asked him to stop, to let me out, but he wouldn't listen. I felt trapped, this terror building inside me with each passing moment. He started driving faster, this reckless speed that made my heart race. I feared for my safety, this dread of what might happen next. I tried to reason with him, to make him see that I was scared, but he seemed unfazed, almost enjoying my fear. I reached for my phone, wanting to call for help, but it slipped from my hand, landing out of reach. I felt this overwhelming sense of helplessness, this dread of what might happen. I looked out, trying to spot any sign of civilization, but it was just darkness, this isolated road that seemed to stretch on endlessly. I contemplated jumping out, risking injury to escape this terrifying situation. But the speed, the rain, it felt too risky, and I held back, this fear paralyzing me. He started making disturbing comments, this eerie conversation turning darker by the minute. I felt this impending danger, this realization that I was at his mercy. I screamed for help, hoping someone might hear, but the rain drowned out my cries. I felt this overwhelming panic, this sheer terror of the unknown. I tried to remain calm, to not provoke him, but his behavior grew more erratic, this sense of menace looming over me. Then, suddenly, the car stopped, and I saw an opportunity. I made a run for it, not looking back, just desperate to escape. I reached a nearby house, banging on the door, pleading for help. The homeowners were shocked to see me in that state, but they let me in and called the police. It was one of those stormy nights, the kind where the wind howled and rain lashed against the windows. I returned home, eager to seek refuge from the tempest outside. As I stepped into the apartment building, I noticed a neighbor lingering in the hallway. He seemed unassuming at first, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. He greeted me with this unnerving smile, this peculiar grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just being polite. I headed towards my apartment, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me, this unsettling sensation that made the hairs on my neck stand. As I fumbled with my keys, I felt this sense of being watched, this uncomfortable feeling that made my skin crawl. I glanced back, and he was still there, this neighbor, just standing in the hallway, watching me. I tried to shake off the unease, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. I entered my apartment, hoping to put that unsettling encounter behind me. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake off this feeling of being observed. I heard strange noises outside my door, faint whispers that sent a chill down my spine. I peeked through the peephole, but there was no one in sight. I tried to dismiss it as the storm playing tricks on my mind, but then there was this persistent knocking at my door. I approached cautiously, heart racing. I asked who it was, but there was no response. The knocking grew louder, this persistent banging that echoed through the hallway. I debated whether to open the door or ignore it, but something compelled me to check. I cautiously unlocked the door, peering into the hallway. There he was, the neighbor, this unsettling figure standing in the dimly lit hallway. He had this eerie smile, this inscrutable expression that made my blood run cold. I asked what he wanted, trying to maintain composure, but he just stood there, not saying a word. His silence was unnerving, this sense of looming danger hanging in the air. I tried to close the door, but he blocked it with his foot, this sudden intrusion that sent panic coursing through me. I demanded he leave, this rising fear of what might happen if he didn't. But he just stood there, this eerie stillness that felt menacing. I tried to reason, to make him understand that he was unwelcome, but he seemed undeterred, almost enjoying my discomfort. I threatened to call the authorities, hoping it might scare him off, but he laughed, this chilling laughter that echoed in the hallway. I managed to shut the door, locking it with trembling hands. But then, I heard scratching sounds, this eerie noise that made my heart skip a beat. I checked the windows, but they were all closed. I felt this growing dread, this fear of the unknown lurking just outside. I considered calling for help, but my phone was in the other room, and I didn't dare leave the safety of my locked apartment. Then, suddenly, the power went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. I felt this overwhelming sense of vulnerability, this dread of what might happen next. I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. My heart raced, and I felt this primal fear, this terror of the unknown. I grabbed whatever I could find, ready to defend myself, my mind racing with thoughts of escape and survival. But then, the power came back on, and the noises ceased. I cautiously peeked outside, but there was no one there. I stayed awake the entire night, this fear gnawing at me, this sense of being watched stayed right there in my mind. It was one of those rainy nights, the kind that feels heavy and oppressive. I had missed the earlier train, and now I was stuck at this deserted station, waiting for the next one. The platform was dimly lit, shadows dancing in the rain. I huddled close to the shelter, trying to stay dry. That's when I noticed someone standing in the shadows, this vague figure lurking at the edge of the platform. At first, I brushed it off, thinking they might be waiting for the train too. But as minutes passed, their presence started to unnerve me. They didn't move or make any sound, just standing there, concealed by the darkness. I tried to distract myself, checking my phone, pretending I wasn't bothered. But this sense of unease gnawed at me, this feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced up again, and they were still there, this mysterious figure lurking in the shadows, barely visible in the rain. I couldn't make out any details, just this silhouette against the backdrop of the night. The train was supposed to arrive soon, but the minutes dragged on. I kept stealing glances towards the shadowy figure, feeling this growing sense of discomfort. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was just someone waiting like me, but this persistent feeling of being watched, of being the sole focus of their attention, it unsettled me. I considered moving to another part of the platform, but something held me back, this fear of drawing attention or provoking a reaction. I looked around, hoping to spot other people, but the station was deserted. It was just me and this mysterious individual, this eerie presence that seemed to linger only for me. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my imagination. But then, they took a step forward, this slow, deliberate movement that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt this overwhelming urge to leave, this primal instinct screaming at me to get away. But the next train was my only way out, and I couldn't afford to miss it. I kept my eyes on them, trying to decipher any details, but they remained shrouded in darkness, this enigmatic presence that made my heart race. I considered asking for help, calling out to anyone who might be nearby, but fear held me back, this terror of what might happen if I drew attention to myself. I tried to remain calm, to not let my fear overwhelm me, but every passing moment felt suffocating, this anticipation of something dreadful about to unfold. Finally, I heard the distant rumble of the train. Relief washed over me, but so did this fear of having to walk past that shadowy figure to get on board. I kept my gaze fixed on them, this intense stare that felt like a silent plea for them to stay away. But as the train approached, they vanished into the darkness, as if they were never there. I rushed onto the train, heart pounding in my chest, and found a seat, trying to steady my nerves. The sense of relief was palpable, but so was this lingering unease, this fear of the unknown. As the train departed, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that mysterious figure lurking in the shadows, but the platform was empty. I arrived at my destination, but that encounter on the rainy night, that lurking figure that sent chills down my spine, it left me shaken, this sense of having narrowly escaped something sinister. This happened last year. The rain was chucking it down and I was driving through this remote area with nowhere to seek shelter. Visibility was getting worse by the minute, and I knew I had to find a place to wait out the storm. That's when I spotted a sign for a small, isolated motel up ahead. I pulled into the gravel lot, the rain pelting against the windshield. The place seemed deserted, eerie almost, with its flickering neon sign and the empty parking lot. I hurried towards the reception, drenched from head to toe. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with a forced smile, greeted me with this odd stare, this penetrating gaze that made me uncomfortable. I asked for a room, hoping to get some rest until the storm passed. She handed me a key without a word, this silence that felt unsettling. As I made my way to the room, I noticed the motel was eerily quiet, this sense of emptiness that felt suffocating. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows down the narrow hallway. I reached my room, and as I unlocked the door, I felt this sense of foreboding, this inexplicable fear gnawing at me. The room was dimly lit, this musty odor lingering in the air. I tried to dismiss the unease, chalking it up to the storm and the remote location. But then, I heard faint whispers, this hushed conversation just beyond the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably guests in neighboring rooms. But the voices grew louder, this murmuring that sounded clandestine, secretive. I decided to leave the room, to inquire about the noises, but as I stepped out, the whispers ceased abruptly, this eerie silence descending upon the corridor. I approached the reception again, wanting to ask about the noises, but the receptionist was nowhere to be seen. The lobby was empty, this deserted feeling sending shivers down my spine. I heard footsteps behind me, this slow, deliberate pace that made my heart race. I turned, expecting to see someone, but the hallway was empty. I felt this overwhelming urge to leave, this sense of danger that I couldn't quite place. I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. I tried to call for help, but the phone was dead, this chilling realization that I was truly alone in this eerie place. Then, there was a knock at the door, this slow, deliberate tapping that made my blood run cold. I hesitated, unsure whether to answer, but the knocking persisted. I cautiously approached the door, this dread building inside me with each step. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway. I backed away, trying to rationalize, but then the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I heard more whispers, this time closer, almost as if they were right outside my door. I felt this suffocating fear, this sense of being trapped in a place where something sinister was unfolding. I checked the window, considering an escape, but the storm outside was relentless, the rain lashing against the glass. I heard a creaking noise, this slow, deliberate sound that made my heart skip a beat. I turned, and the door was slightly ajar, just a crack. I felt this overwhelming terror, this realization that someone or something was inside the room with me. I tried to push the door shut, but it wouldn't budge. I braced myself, ready for whatever might come through that door, my heart pounding in my chest. Then suddenly, the door slammed shut, and everything fell silent. I was alone again, surrounded by this eerie quietness. I mustered all my courage and opened the door, ready to leave. but the hallway was empty, no sign of anyone or anything. I dashed towards my car, this fear pushing me to get away from that place. The rain was pouring heavily, and I was out for my evening run in the park. I wasn't prepared for this sudden downpour, and I desperately needed shelter. I spotted a small gazebo ahead, tucked away in a secluded corner of the park. Relieved, I hurried towards it, seeking refuge from the rain. As I reached the gazebo, I noticed a man sitting on one of the benches nearby. He seemed harmless at first, just sitting there in the rain. I didn't want to intrude, so I kept to myself, seeking shelter under the gazebo. But as the rain intensified, I realized I needed to find a way home soon. I glanced towards the man, hoping he could lend me an umbrella or offer some help. He noticed me looking and smiled, this friendly gesture that put me slightly at ease. I approached him cautiously, asking if he had an umbrella or knew where I could find shelter nearby. He nodded, his smile widening, but there was something off about it, something that made me uneasy. He offered to walk me to a nearby shelter, and I hesitated for a moment. But I thought it would be safer to have someone with me in this rain-soaked solitude. We started walking, and as we did, I noticed he was walking a bit too close for comfort. I tried to maintain a polite distance, but he kept edging closer. I started to feel this growing sense of unease, this discomfort that settled in the pit of my stomach. His demeanor had shifted slightly, this subtle change that made me nervous. I tried to make light conversation, asking about the park and the surrounding area, hoping to ease the tension. But his responses were short, almost evasive. I suggested turning back, saying I would manage on my own, but he insisted on accompanying me, his tone growing more insistent. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was overreacting, but then he grabbed my arm, this sudden and forceful grip that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I tried to pull away, to break free from his hold, but he tightened his grip, his demeanor turning menacing. He started speaking in a low, threatening tone, saying things that made my blood run cold. I knew I had to get away, to find help, but the park was deserted, and the rain was relentless. Panic started to set in, this overwhelming fear of what might happen next. I struggled, trying to break free from his grasp, but he wouldn't let go. I screamed for help, hoping someone would hear, but the rain drowned out my cries. I saw a group of people in the distance, and I tried to signal them, but they didn't seem to notice. The man's grip tightened, and he dragged me towards a more secluded area of the park. I fought with all my strength, kicking and screaming, trying to draw attention. But the more I struggled, the more he seemed to enjoy it, this twisted satisfaction in his eyes. I knew I had to do something, anything to escape. I elbowed him hard, catching him off guard, and managed to break free momentarily. I sprinted as fast as I could, running towards the main road, hoping to find help. The rain was blurring my vision, and I stumbled, but I kept running. I heard him behind me, his footsteps echoing in the rain-soaked silence. I didn't dare look back, this overwhelming fear driving me to keep running. I finally reached the main road, and I saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I practically jumped inside, begging them to drive away. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. As we drove off, I felt this overwhelming relief, this sense of narrowly escaping something horrific. The police arrived at the scene, and I recounted the terrifying ordeal. They searched the park but found no trace of the man,